Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the introductions because I don't want to waste a single moment of time with these amazing educators. Thank you everybody for joining. This is just to ground you on where you are in case you're not sure. This is part of the webinar. This is a webinar as part of the International Competency-Based Health Professions Educators Collaborative, or ICBE Collaborative webinar series. It's a series that goes out to people across the world, both live and recordings that people view later. Last year, our webinar team reached out to educators from across the globe to find out what should be the through line for this year's webinar series. And what we heard is that people want stories on CBE implementation, lessons learned, and strategies for managing the challenges that come with change and innovation. And today, we are tackling the often fraught topic of negotiation. Negotiation is part and parcel to any innovation and implementation efforts, and we are so lucky to have two incredible leaders with us today to share their wisdom. The title for today's webinar is Batting Your Best BATNA, Negotiation Skills and Competency-Based Education. And if you don't know what BATNA is, you're in the right place, and you and I are going to learn together because I am still a novice in many of these skills. Now, we've asked our speakers to give us a brief primer on negotiation, followed by some time for question and answers and to share their real-world experiences. Throughout the webinar, I want to invite you to put your reflections, comments, or questions in the chat. We'll have Dr. Adele Atkinson and Dr. Kelly Kavarzegi will be monitoring and responding, and we will also pull some of your questions to toss to our experts. And now, without further ado, please let me introduce our two experts. First, I'll introduce Dr. Lou Edgy. Dr. Edgy is the inaugural Dr. David M. Wu and Dr. Bernadine E. Wu Endowed Professor and Senior Associate Dean of Medical Education at the University of Michigan Medical School. She is a board-certified family physician, chair of the Family Medicine Review Committee at the ACGME, and on the executive committee of the AMA's Council on Medical Education. She's a 2023 Executive Leadership in Academic Medicine alumna and a 2025 Compass Award recipient. She's also a recipient of the 2022 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award from the University of Cincinnati and the Distinguished Humanitarian Alumni Award from the University of Michigan. Dr. Edgy, who has a master's in health professions education, is responsible for medical education at the University of Michigan, supporting 2,400 medical students and residents and 3,500 faculty. Her interests include mitigating bias in assessment, generative AI and precision education, and health policy. Dr. Edgy, thank you for being here. Next, we have Dr. Monica Lipson. Dr. Lipson is a board-certified internist and the Vice Dean for Education at Columbia University's Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons, pardon me if I mispronounced that, and serves as the Rolf H. Scholdegger Professor of Medicine at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. She previously served as a professor and vice chair of medicine and division director of general internal medicine at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. She has also served as president of the Society of General Internal Medicine. In these roles, Dr. Lipson provides visionary leadership for a diverse group of faculty and students involved in education and innovation, medical education research, and community outreach. Her focuses are on innovation and improvement in health professions education and assessment, health equity, workforce diversity, faculty development, medical care delivery, and provider communication skills. Dr. Lipson's research interests include health professions training assessment, historical and contemporary trends in medical education, academic leadership, and the underrepresentation of minoritized learners in academic medicine. Oh my goodness, that is so much expertise on one webinar. I cannot believe it. I'm so excited. Dr. Edgy, Dr. Lipson, thank you so much for being here and sharing your expertise with us. I will turn it over. The floor is yours to teach us about negotiation.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me a little bit better than before. So we'll be talking about batting your best BATNA, and it's a two-part batting position here. I'm going to do the first part, and then Monica will do the second part, and we're happy to take questions, per Ben's urging. So first of all, there are 6 different things that we'll be looking at. I will be articulating the goals and research needs to support your position when you're negotiating. I'll also be looking at access or assessing your bargaining power and analyzing negotiating setting, and then also talking about negotiation scripts. And then she'll get into shuttle diplomacy and a couple other things. So the main thing that we want to do is just let you know from my standpoint, I'll walk you through these 6 different pieces here, 1 slide for each of these. The first one will be deciding what you want. And I think what happens very commonly is that we tend to pick up things that we are very used to using in the past. And so I am a fan of backward design for assessment, where you go ahead and identify what is the desired result or the outcome, then you determine the assessment evidence, and then you plan your learning experience and instruction. The same thing for me applies with determining what you want as far as negotiation. And so again, identifying desired results, determining the success evidence, like, did your negotiation actually work? What evidence will show you that you were successful? And then planning your ask. And I think a lot of times what we don't do is actually put the ask right beside the goal. So for example, if you go ahead and have a 1-year goal, you should have several asks that go with that particular goal. Important to note that we don't start working on our 10-year goals in 10 years. So when you are negotiating, you want to make sure that you know what portion of your 10-year goal you're going to ask for in your first year, for example. And also, you want to make sure that you're not just asking for tangible goals, but and asks, but also intangible ones. For example, does the work culture actually match my advocacy culture? For example, with Dr. Zaghi, I go ahead and do advocacy every 6 months on the national level. That was one thing that was absolutely a walk-away piece for my particular negotiation for the job I have currently. Doing your research. And I put a clock on this because I think we do not take the time to do the research that's needed before we go into negotiation. So if I were to think about competency-based medical education or health professions education, and I'm thinking of something like Promote in Place and wanted to talk to the medical staff about embracing the fact that we're graduating a learner 6 months earlier, I want to know, has there been an issue with early attendings, people who are early in their career having problems with with litigation or anything like that? Are there concerns that are existing in the space? So doing your research. The job that I am in currently, Senior Associate Dean job, I actually did a parallel track. So I did 2 negotiations within the same institution at the same time. They were probably about 2 weeks apart. My research was over 1,300 pages with notes. It's about taking the time to really think very deeply about who are the people you're interviewing with, what is their background, do they actually have the power to actually make any decisions on your behalf during the negotiation? Are they the final decision maker, or are they the intermediary? You also want to think about what is the impact of not negotiating. So if I stand where I am and in 4 years I'm still in the same space, what effect does that have on my goals for education for my learners and so on? And then the other thing then would be, where do you find credible information? And that may be, again, if we go ahead and look at the Promote in Place idea, and you're talking to a medical staff administrator, has that person been in the position long enough to know the historical context of, what the nursing culture is to receive a learner into that space, for example? Assessing your bargaining power. This one, actually, there's several levers of bargaining power. One of them is information. The other is what are the alternatives to what is being negotiated? What is your status? And then also social capital. So you need to understand, what are you bringing to the table? Can you actually, between now and the time you start in this position, actually bring your value up? What existing relationships do you have that you could bring to the table and leverage when you become a member of this new team? Give behavioral answers. So give an idea about things that you've actually done, evidence of what you've done in the past that they're looking for. And so, for example, if I were to think about CBME, graduates from your program may be the ones that are giving, primary care to the majority of other physicians in the medical staff. That is something that is a historical context that is useful for you. You definitely do want to understand your vulnerabilities. So thinking that, again, if you're trying to, I think at Cincinnati, we went through this, trying to decide if we have an increased number of assessment points that are needed for defensible decisions, that will increase the work of the faculty. Have I understood how I'm going to address those increased needs that the faculty will have? Be able to explain how you've mitigated previous weaknesses. For example, in this situation, all your assessment decisions for competency-based health education will only happen if there's unanimous faculty vote, for example. Your trying to mitigate problems down the line. And then, of course, explore how you can strengthen your position. Sizing up your situation, know how many parties are there, know how many issues there are, know the nature of the relationship. Is this person about to leave? For example, our dean, we're in the process of searching for a new dean. The current dean is in negotiations for certain things as he leaves that are part of his legacy, but he'll only be here for 7 weeks. And so making sure that the people who are involved in the negotiations are also people who will be here for the long term. Know where the contract is binding. That's probably not as applicable in this space, but also knowing if this argument is going to be public or private. And then knowing the known unknowns. I think the biggest issue about known unknowns is really the politics on the ground. There are certain things that you'll never know about a negotiation, the intangible component of what are the politics on ground when you start with a position. And then choose your tactics. Monica's actually going to go into the right side of this, talking about interest-based bargaining. It's less helpful to be in the competitive bargaining space because medical education is a very small community. And most of the time, you'll probably end up needing to work with folks down the line. You don't want to sever relationships. You do also want to go ahead and make sure that you're choosing your writing your script. And so part of this is going to be making sure that you are not only writing it, but you're taking it with you. So rank what order of importance each of the things on your list are. Always ask for more than what you want. Our medical students came in with their BATNA, and you'll learn about that. But there was their final answer in a negotiation we had the other day. That's what they brought to the table immediately, and this had to do with diversity, equity, inclusion in our institution. And you can't start with the absolute musts. Make a provisional concession plan. I think a lot of times we fear moving into that. What is the next if I don't get what I want category? But yeah, you definitely have to think about that. And then decide what you want to give up so you get more of what you want. So there's something that doesn't mean much to you, but it's on the table already. You could probably give that up and get something else, and you're a flexible candidate. And note what is not negotiable. So I'm going to pass it off to Monica and go from there.
Yeah, well, thank you. The best part of this panel is I get to work with friends of mine, so I'm grateful to be here today. I've got a little bit of cold, so excuse my voice. And so now you've sort of started to talk about what you want. Hopefully you have a little bit of a script about how you might do this. And we're going to talk about some of those tactics that Lou sort of expressed about, shuttle diplomacy and indirect conflict resolution. Say it is a small medical education community. There might be things that you want to do more discreetly than others. How to navigate educational context with attention to power and structure, and then the BATNA. We'll talk about that, how to enhance your negotiation. And so these are the frames at which we will sort of think about our work today. In terms of shuttle diplomacy, what's a BATNA, which is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement? What actually is interest-based bargaining, and political frame? So Lou gave an example, the medical students coming in with their red line, for instance. The problem with that is that's not really a negotiation. That's either you give me what I want or not. But interest-based bargaining really focuses on what one's interest is versus what their position is. So if we take that example, the interest of the medical students might be to ensure I have a learning environment that respects diversity. Their interest in that example might be, how do we ensure that my interest is making sure that all medical students have role models that look like them. Those are interests, and those are things that now you can have a discussion about on either side of the negotiation, what you want to do. So that's how you go about. You stop taking positions and you identify mutual interests. And then there's this collaboration for a win-win solution. So often when you use interest-based bargaining, say in an employment union negotiation, what you're really trying to do is expand the pie. And that means that you're not trying to give something so you have to take something away, but you might decide, oh, I'll give an example, the Sim Center. I need more time in the Sim Center for my surgery residents to practice laparoscopic skills. The Sim Center is saying, well, I don't have any money to open on the weekends. And if you're interested in enhancing surgery resident skills and ensuring that the Sim Center is a viable business entity, one suggestion of increasing the pie would be, how can we bring in CME activities into the Sim Center to help offset the cost, right? So now I've found a way to increase the pie where one doesn't have to give up another. And then I think Lou did this right on task, relational negotiating, right? Interest-based bargaining allows you to stay in relationship with the people that you're negotiating with. And you want to separate the people from the problem. And it allows you to move. And as educators with learners and our peers, we have to stay, whether we want to or not, in relationship often. And interest-based bargaining allows us to do that. And then finally, using fair standards. So insisting on using objective criteria about how you're going to measure these things. So in that example I gave before, the Sim Center tells the surgery department exactly how much money they need. They don't try to inflate it, deflate it, etc. They're really using objective criteria. And you might agree, okay, if we can't make this amount of money, then we will stop. So what's a BATNA? This is one of my favorite things that I think about this, and this is Yuri getting to yes or getting past no. These are international negotiation experts who talk about a BATNA, again, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And this refers to the most favorable option available if the negotiation fails. So again, let's go back to the example that Lou gave. Like the students came in with a red line. If the students had come in with, I really want to understand how we could keep the DEI office and what can we do about this, their red line might have been, if they don't do anything, we're going to walk away. But you don't present that as your first salvo into the argument. I use this a lot in my marriage, right? Like as I'm trying to compromise, what exactly am I willing to stand for and what is a good way, okay, I'm going to walk away if you tell me that I have to show up at this party for 4 hours, right? Maybe we could negotiate the party that I don't like the people. I only have to go for 1 hour. So you need to know what your BATNA is. And what the BATNA does is it actually gives you confidence. So Ben talked about, like, I don't feel comfortable. I don't want to get into it. But if you go into that car dealership, you've done your research and you know that the car that you want, for the make and model year, that you're not willing to pay more than $45,000, used car, of course, then actually you now don't have to feel so bad. So if they give you a number that's more than $45,000, you're like, this is easy. And so it allows you to build confidence and it provides protection for you and it increases your bargaining power. And then the considerations you want to think about as you develop your BATNA is what are the strengths and the weakness of your position or interest and alternatives so that you make a BATNA that actually is useful. So again, if you want to think about this, you want to know what the alternative is, set your bottom line, compare all offers to your BATNA, right? So you think that running this curriculum course is going to take 20% of your time. They come in and say, we think that this course, you go in and saying, well, maybe this course takes 50% of time. You know that you can't do more than, if anything, less than 25%. So now as you're negotiating with the deans about how much time this course takes, you've got a large range of negotiation between 50% FTE and 25% FTE. But at 25% FTE, you're going to say, I can't do it. I can't do it well. you want to kind of guess what your party's BATNA is, right? Like, so you want to be smart about your BATNA. And usually in negotiations, we can guess what the other party's BATNA might be. You might not have it exactly, but you do understand it. And then again, you can walk away competently, and it gives you some protection. And it allows you to stay grounded and from accepting poor deals. So some examples of this as it applies to competency-based health professions education is really how we think about leadership skills. So one way is you might be navigating a learner's remediation process. And as the faculty member, you want to show self-awareness and empathy actually on your part as well as the learner, right? Because you might be mad at the learner for some reason. You want to know what your BATNA is. So you want to understand the learner situation and the instructional alternatives that you can give, but your BATNA might be you have to make this up, right? Now, how the learner might make it up and what conditions there might be, that's where the negotiation might be. But the BATNA is you can't move, you can't progress learner until you do some sort of remediation. Another way is we thinking about clinical competency committees, you want to have social skills and self-regulation. And so there's no reason to raise your voice when you're in negotiation, especially if you're talking about interests, right? Positions make you stand behind lines and often get heated. But if we're talking about mutual interests, it's a lot easier to have tactful social skills and self-regulation. And a BATNA allows you to negotiate without compromising your standards. And it allows you to hear the diverse faculty opinions with a commitment to outcomes. So if you're listening in a competency committee, you're listening to all the voices about a learner, and your BATNA might be, we won't graduate anyone unless this full committee feels like they're competent to move on. And then supporting faculty through change. So this is another leadership skill for clinician educators. I work in the dean's office, right? So I have to manage not only the interest of the medical students or graduate students, the interest of the faculty, and then the interest, by the way, of the person who pays me, the dean and the president of the university, right? So how do you do that? And the best way is to think about your BATNA and make sure that it aligns with institutional change and values to reduce resistance. Having a BATNA helps you when you're getting pushback about that assignment. I really think I should have an A. You know, I'm a half a point away from an A, right? A BATNA helps you set clear boundaries and maintain trust and safety when you're talking about that with a learner. And then finally, thinking about institutional credibility. So it's great that Lou's students came and said that they want to advocate for this position, right? Like we don't want to stamp that down, but we actually want to put it in a context where we can actually have a conversation. So sometimes that means a little bit of shuttle diplomacy. So this is one that I kind of use a lot. At Columbia, I'm touching a third rail, which is the name of Columbia is the Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. The and surgeons part means that our medical students do all surgical subspecialties in their clinical year. I think that 2 out of the 4 might be useful, 3 out of the 4 might be useful, 4 out of the 4 is just, it's difficult. But you can imagine at the College of Physicians and Surgeons, this is, so I've been doing a lot of shuttle diplomacy. So I've been talking to, like, if I was at a dinner with the department chair of surgery, I was like, hey, I've been thinking about this problem. And he was like, well, that makes sense. You know, we don't want to, right? Like you're saying you want to enhance the education, give more time in the OR, right? That makes sense. I went to the department chair of physical medicine and rehab. Physical medicine and rehab has no time in the clinical year. I tell him my problem. He's like, well, they should be grateful to have anything that. So now by the time I get around to having to present this to the chairs, my shuttle diplomacy carefully has sort of helped me to the point where I know I'm touching a third rail, but I've started to get the insights about what problems people think and how to do that. And so it allows you to move in places, especially when there's low trust, right? So you're building trust. You hear this often in our diplomatic relationships internationally, right? Shuttle diplomacy, you're like, people are actually still talking between us and China. They're not doing it in a very public way. There's like shuttle diplomacy happening behind the scenes. And then it allows you to clarify interests and preserve the relationship. So it's an indirect way that sometimes you got to move to when needed. So back to a simulation center case in terms of fiscal negotiation. So again, the faculty requests an expanded sim center access. The director cites staff and budget limits. We talked about this. So interest-based bargaining talks about like hands-on training versus sustainability versus compliance with accreditation rules. The shuttle diplomacy that might happen in that regard is the associate dean goes to the department chair of surgery, goes to the dean and starts to say, I think this is really important. Maybe we can come up with an idea to do this. Is sort of running interference with the angry faculty that might be demanding that the sim center stays open. And then the outcome ideally is expanded simulation use. The trust is restored between the center and the surgery department, and there's a rebalance of priorities. So now the sim center might be open on the weekends. The surgery faculty are there supporting their CME activities, but now everybody realizes, hey, maybe the CME activities will be great for the residents as well. And so it allows for this balanced priorities of outcomes coming up. So that's a recap of a little bit of some strategies about, how to create interest, how to make sure that every negotiation you go in with a BATNA, and I mean, you can use that in all parts of your life, how shuttle diplomacy might work, and then what's the outcome you want. So with that, we're going to open it up for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you both, Dr. Lips and Dr. Edgy. What an awesome overview. And I really appreciate it because you all have been in many types of negotiations at different levels of education around different things. And for someone like me who is a people pleaser, not always the most assertive around negotiation, having some of these concrete strategies is really helpful to go back to. And I love the idea of a BATNA to help us like make that decision before we go into those heated, adrenaline-filled moments so that we almost can just fall back. It's like knowing your algorithm going into a code. You know what to do before you can get there. So I love that. I'm going to go ahead and ask a few questions that I have. If others have questions they want to put in the chat, please do, and we can pass them along to Dr. Edgy and Dr. Lipson. One question I want to start with is specifically about CBE. So when you're thinking about competency-based education implementation, that can mean a lot of different things depending on your context and the resources you have or don't have. But I'm curious, when you're thinking about things that are needed in competency-based education, what are some of the things that are like musts you should make sure that you're negotiating for? And then are there any things that people might not think about but would be important to consider negotiating for?
So I think I mentioned partly increased faculty time, FTE, because, if assessment is a sine qua non of CBME, then you need to have more faculty because you have more assessment points. You need to have your clinical competency committee meeting more frequently, et cetera, et cetera. So when I think of what we do in advocacy, we advocate for human and material resources. And to the extent that both of those two things are ingredients in successful CBME, then it definitely needs to happen.
And some of the things that you might not anticipate are cultural. And so I work at the second oldest medical school in the US, right? It predates the Revolutionary War. And so change, you can imagine, is not like the first thing on anybody's mind on a given day. And so I had to come in and appreciate that. I had to come in and appreciate the historical context of the school, its place in time, etc. And so some of what you might be negotiating in CBME is actually a cultural change and helping faculty, particularly who weren't educated this way, understand that, right? Because you're going to get a lot of pushback, not because you don't have enough assessments, not because the faculty didn't have any time. This is dumb because I wasn't trained this way.
Interesting. Kind of along those lines, what are the things that you find most challenging to negotiate?
As a vice dean, quite frankly, is when people don't have a direct ask. Right. So I find myself actually helping people with what you're trying to ask me to do. And some of that is just a mentorship, right? Like it's a mentorship activity, which is kind of funny because sometimes I'll be like, well, this is what you might want to ask me, but I'm right, like I'm not sure I'd say yes, but like this is what you might present to me. Um, and what I find, to your point, Ben, again, what you're saying, this is why we want people to be more comfortable, is that they kind of walk around the issue and they never come in and ask the question. I don't know, Lou.
Oh, I was actually looking at Kelly's, Dr. Kawasaki's question in the chat. You know, he was asking about, you know, the seasoned individual who's been in a role for a while and really they're not looking to move. I am a huge fan of growth mindset, and I think we do not come to a screeching halt in our careers and ask ourselves, are we still growing? You can stay in the same position, but if you're not growing, you shouldn't even be in that position. So, you know, always digesting new information, you know, understanding how do we integrate AI into medical education, and, you know, what are the fundamental, you know, competencies that should be in that space, and so on and so forth. We should always be growing. So as far as negotiating for growth, one thing I learned as an executive leadership and academic medicine fellow is that women do not negotiate as often as men in their job. And so, for example, let's say I have a 5-year contract. Most of us would probably, you know, year 6 point whatever, decide, okay, time to sit down and think about what we need for our next year. In general, the literature shows that men negotiate every single year of that 5-year contract. Who knew? But yes, that is what the literature shows. And so, you know, it's again an opportunity for you to look at how you've grown over the past year, articulate that to whomever, you know, put that as your BATNA and move forward with your growth.
I think the other piece that we've been struggling with, so this is a work in progress, is thinking about term limits, even for our educators, because education leadership positions are limited in all of our, and so in order to turn over things, especially to give junior faculty, mid-career faculty an opportunity, is actually to do that, and then finding, like Lou said, roles for those folks. But sometimes this just comes down to money, right? I'm used to having X amount of protected time, and sometimes that's a meaningful conversation. Yes, I understand that, but
so when I came to answer one of the questions here in the chat from Anna, so I had been asked to put my hat in the ring for this job and the chair of family medicine. And I grappled because that can actually end up backfiring, but it was too much of an awesome opportunity to come back to Michigan. I was a medical student here in 91. I'm 55. And so, you know, I said, that's it, we're going to do it. And there was 2 weeks apart. It was 92 interviews, as I mentioned. But one of the things I realized is that chairs negotiate a package for the department and deans in general don't. And I'm like, heck no, we are going to be negotiating a package for my medical education community as well. You know, and so again, I was a finalist for both. I put that aside, but I took some of the lessons from the chair negotiations into the other space. And so what kinds of things might I negotiate annually? As I mentioned, you don't start your 10-year goals in 10 years. So in my contract, I negotiated what is going to happen year 1, what is going to happen year 2, so that by the time I get to year 5, I've got X goal taken care of. I also negotiated no barriers to utilizing those funds. So I said, this is going to be an actual, just give me the short code. And if I find that there's a chief resident leadership workshop that I want to fund, I give them the short code and it's done. There's no bureaucracy. So I also negotiated for things I didn't want to have in my space, like some barriers on those dollar amounts.
The other thing is, just this morning, I was looking at faculty FTE. So I have a roster of faculty that I pay. I took over. I'm not quite sure what the rationale was before. We're actually slowly right-sizing that, right? We're trying to come to an FTE effort. My shuttle diplomacy is that I know the dean and the department chairs are trying to come up with an effort strategy for the entire school. I know that we have a new compensation plan, so I made education go first in this conversation because I knew all these things were happening because I get to sit at the leadership table. And so one of the things that I do is, especially if I'm going to cut, there's a course director who gets paid a lot, and we can't quite figure out why they get paid a lot, just based on the hours of the course and et cetera. But I don't go in and say, I'm going to cut your salary basically in half, and you got to figure out what you're going to do. My conversations have been, okay, I'm going to pay half of it this year. Next year, I'm going to do something different. Because it's March right now, or I'll keep you whole until the second half, right? Because, knowing that you got to open out another clinic or do a few more weeks on service or go to the OR a few more times is not fair. So I'm understanding the other person's side of you and trying to come up with negotiating strategies. Marginalized students leverage the virtue of otherness. So one of the strategies that I have often asked is actually to negotiate through questions. So you can imagine at times some stereotypes that might hit me about my tone and my approach to things, about being an angry Black woman, right? I'm actually very aware of that. So one of the ways I negotiate is by asking questions. So, is it that you expect me to do this job with this amount of effort and this much time? How do you propose that I do that? Have you taken into account, what other things should I take into account, right? So I'm actually negotiating, but I'm doing it in a way to ask questions. And I think from the perspective of you're worried about what the stereotype might be about you in an environment, but also you don't understand, if you're marginalized, you might not understand the cultural norms, right? There might be a whole level of shuttle diplomacy that you don't have access to. And so asking questions as a way to negotiate, I find is very helpful, and as is a BATNA. So back to lose medical students. If they had come in and said, and I know that this is right, like I have those same medical students, so I don't mean to pick on Michigan. I was there for, and said, look, we are really interested in preserving these key things around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now we can have a conversation, right? What's important? What's that? Or how do you think that a learner that looks like me would feel comfortable in your environment? That's the way you could start to negotiate around those DEI principles.
Yeah,
Lou is
just
good at
dovetailing.
this.
Well, dovetailing off of that, I mean, this meeting was actually, when our institution said we're moving away from certain things, we created space to have a discussion and really listen deeply to them. So it was an hour and a half that we'd set aside from 5 to 6:30. And so this BATNA came in a single space, double-sided sheet of paper with 10 demands that are multi-partite, et cetera, et cetera. And if you didn't do this, then we would go ahead and tell all our applicants not to come to Michigan. Well, I'm not going into negotiation about this. Our issue was a couple of things. Number one, they were concerned about safety, they were concerned about protection, they were concerned about DI, they were concerned about accountability. So we answered each of those 4 buckets. So we reset everything. We're like, I do not have to answer line by line. We reset that. We answered misinformation. We gave resources, and we sent this letter, our response letter, to every applicant. And our second look, again, was a success. It went very well. They felt heard. And we said, listen, we are interested in outcomes. The process is what's changed. You know, on matters of principle, stand like a rock. On matters of style, swim with the tide. The rocks are being moved in the water, and this is why you're anxious. But going back to one of the questions that is in the chat here, we live in a tripartite mission institution. So the clinical, the research, and the education. And as I said, I was going down the family medicine chair path. And in that negotiation, I talked about integrating AI into primary care. So one of the things that I have been doing is helping the clinical mission to create space. So ambient AI, all these things, so that there's more space for education. So working in the clinical to help make room for education, you're much more likely to have, you know, an additional learner, be able to actually speak one-on-one to them, do precision education with them, you know, those types of things.
I think, Lou, you bring up this important point about understanding what the other person is worried about, right? I think about this. I manage my boss's I manage what my boss is worried about all the time, right? Because if I manage what they're worried about all the time, I'm an asset.
Yes, absolutely. That is brilliant.
This is such an awesome conversation. I can tell everybody, all the participants have a lot of questions too. I wanted to jump in with one of my own, if that's okay. I'm wondering, when you're thinking about like competency-based education, there's like all sorts of levels, and you both have hit on these already. There's like institutional negotiation for things like funds and resources and time. There's negotiation with frontline faculty on assessment and coaching. There's negotiation with learners on, you know, we've seen some learners in some places upset about EPAs or different types of assessment. So I was curious, how do you think about, I guess 2 questions. One, does your negotiation approach change depending on which level you're negotiating at, whether it's institutional leaders versus faculty versus learners? And then how do you think about the order at which you engage those? Do you like go up the hierarchy, down the hierarchy, or does it just depend on the situation?
I will say that, yes, situational leadership is really important, but you want to be the same authentic person in all the spaces. So, for example, you know, my CEO wants me to give him the high, you know, bullet point version. He trusts me because of the relationship that we've built together. He's like, okay, Lou, that sounds reasonable. Go for it. The learners, I'll probably need to do some co-production with them to go ahead and get some of the details around it before I present it to him, and just see, is this even a viable thing? Are there things I haven't thought about, you know, as I come forward? So I sort of apply the logic model to some of my decision, like who are my stakeholders here? What do I need to gather for the outcome that I want in the end?
And then the other thing is, I actually find it easier top down, right? So just in terms of ease negotiation, it's easy for me to negotiate at the institutional level. And I think, to Lou, like, I think learners are a harder negotiation, because sometimes, despite the fact that you want to be as transparent and authentic as possible, right, there are times when you can't do that. And so you're carefully thinking about like what interest there is, what interest there's not. And it does cause, it's difficult for me. Maybe I'll put it that way. It's easy. I don't mind going into a CEO's office. I'm not worried about how they feel about the learning environment, right? Like,
right.
And so I think that that's a thing to think about.
I think the other thing is the length of the relationship makes a difference as well. So, you know, I'm going to be working, you know, for years, you know, in this space with probably consistent, you know, institutional leadership. The learners are turning over. And so the principals have to remain consistent in that space, but it's going to be different folks. When I was a program director, you know, we had a a rotation, and the residents came in and they're like, you know what, we do not get anything out of rotating with this ophthalmologist. And then the next year, the other group wanted to rotate with this ophthalmologist. So, you know, again, it's like, what are the principles around here? What is, you know, there sometimes you have to kind of lead the pack in that space as opposed to go with what they.
And then to answer Bob's, nice to see you, Bob, question in the chat about advocating for education. Well, I'm so glad that nobody talked about the fact that I'm from Columbia today. I don't think we hit the Wall Street Journal or New York Times quite yet today. One of the things in that environment, quite frankly, is education is the solid rock. Education is the place, if you don't have I'm in the middle of LCME or accreditation workshop. If the school's not accredited, all this other stuff becomes for naught. And actually, the benefit of what's been happening recently actually shows that. And I think this is somewhat of a job security for those in the US, as there's more and more attacks on how we pay for healthcare or research, right? Education is actually the structural framework for which all of those other missions start off from. And sometimes it's currently just this idea right now that is actually true, right? We often feel like second-class citizens, and I think not. And so I think advocating for education, I often try to do it as a win-win. So when I was at Michigan, an example was we needed to do a house officer OSCE. No one had any money. I went to patient safety and got money, right? Why does the patient safety people care about, you know, assessment of trainees? Well, actually, they care a lot because they know there's so right. I had to find a win-win. No, and then someone actually came to me like, no one's ever come to us, you know, risk management and patient safety to ask for money for education, right? Like, so it's this idea of trying to think about how to make a win-win and grow the pie.
I love that. This is such great conversation. And something that Dr. Edgy said earlier really resonated with me, kind of with the curve of the earth. And learners are in our spaces for a relatively short period of time most of the time. And something like competency-based education is like really complex intervention that sometimes, you know, is years to implement. And sometimes the downstream like benefits are not realized immediately because there's this, you know, there's struggle and challenge with any kind of implementation efforts. And it's, I think, sometimes hard when you're one of the only people that can see the entire picture over a broad period of time to have those negotiations and make asks of people. And it takes a bit of a leap of faith, I think, on those people's parts, whether it's frontline faculty or learners. So really challenging. There was another great question that popped up in the chat, actually, from Dr. Busari. He asked, are there contexts where BATNA and shadow diplomacy won't work, and what do you do then?
There are contexts where shadow diplomacy doesn't work, right? Because either it's not really in the shadows, right? Somebody's made it public. They were disingenuous. I have never had a time when a BATNA doesn't work, because the BATNA is all about you, right? The BATNA will always work. So I think that's the place where you should spend a lot of time, because I have never had a BATNA fail me.
I would agree. Well, I mean, coming into this job, you know, the issue was, you know, I do physician advocacy in DC and on the Hill. I've been to DC 3 times and Lansing once, our state capital, to talk about education and, you know, dismantlement of the Department of Education, all these things, because this is important to me. So when I came into this job, I was like, there will be 2 weeks out of every year where I will be gone doing this stuff. And of course, it was my BATNA. This is what I would walk away from, because it's what gives me zero burnout. It's what keeps me motivated. It helps me to be connected to a larger purpose outside of my institution, you know, and so forth. So for me, that was my BATNA, and she's like, "Oh, sure, no problem." So, you know, but it could have been a situation where I was happily back with Ben, as I enjoyed being with Ben in Cincinnati.
Come back to us, Dr. Edgy. Um, I, I wanna touch back to something Dr. Lipson said earlier, and maybe we can answer this one more question and then a last word of wisdom from each of you. Dr. Lipson, you said sometimes one of the hardest things for you is when you don't even know what somebody's asking for. And I admit, like, I struggle with that myself. In fact, the first time I asked, this is a true story, the first time I asked my wife out on a date, she did not realize I'd asked her out on a date because I was so indirect and embarrassed to do it because I'm not a very assertive person. And so, as people on this call are thinking about going into negotiations around CBE, whether it's for time, money, making an ask of faculty members, some people might be really energized by that and naturally gifted, and some people might need to practice. So, how do you recommend people practice these skills? And does have you tried practicing with like ChatGPT as an opponent, or do you just get a friend or a colleague? How do you recommend people practice if you're less experienced with negotiation?
I'll give you a shout out to Lou. How many times do we chat about like what we might be negotiating on either side of our jobs? So Lou and I, like I have a buddy, right? Like you find a buddy and you're like, well, does this sound reasonable? Does this not sound reasonable? So I do practicing and finding a buddy that you trust. Uh, it was funny, like people called me about Michigan, right? Lou, I knew, right? Because I'd been in conversation with Lou for weeks. So that's one thing that you can do. And I think it is important. The other thing is to really craft it as a question. Like if you can make it into a question that somebody can understand, one or two sentences, then it's a question. If you're like, well, I have a mentee right now. I like this community stuff. I really want to help the residents. Oh, I want to do faculty development in the division, and they're not being you know, they're not responding to you because you haven't asked a question.
I appreciate that. Dr. Edgy, any advice on practicing?
I definitely had a friend who came on Zoom with me, and it wasn't just, hey Lou, it was she was on point as soon as the Zoom clicked in, and she timed me. She's like, you know what? Typically you have 3 minutes per answer. That was 45 seconds. You can beef this piece up. That was way too long. Cut that back. And just also hearing the things you're asking. You need to know your worth, and sometimes we have a difficult time articulating that just the way we've been brought up. But you are advocating for yourself in a negotiation that involves a BATNA almost always. But also, if you're passionate about your learners, you're going to be trying to negotiate hard for them as well. So practice. I practice with people.
That's the other reason to grow your network. So if you just think about your career, this is why you need to grow your network and why you need to grow your network outside your institution, right? Because the other thing is you want to be able, I could say to Lou, this is what I negotiated for. Why don't you like, so you know what is possible too. And when you actually use your network, what you find is there's a lot possible that you
Yes.
just didn't even think of.
I love that. Well, I learned a ton from both of you. I learned I'm going to spend a lot more time figuring out my BATNA before I go into any of these conversations, whether it's with frontline learners or with institutional leaders. I really appreciate that. And something that Dr. Edgy said earlier really stuck with me is thinking about the cost of not negotiating at all. For someone like me who doesn't really get energized by negotiation, I have to keep that in mind. So the opportunity cost. Before we sign off, do you have any last words of wisdom for people who are in the thick of CBME implementation or potentially just starting out with their implementation and innovation efforts?
Never let fear be a counselor. I think so many times, it won't happen, or I'm afraid that that's going to fail. If you're starting to feel that, pull that out of the equation and think, what would happen if fear was not an issue, and actually then work on that, because so many times the possible has not even been done because people were afraid.
And fear is just an emotion. We think it's
Yes.
something, it's just an emotion. And the, you know, to the point Lou said, you can overcome it. And I would recommend you just, everybody try your BATNA.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both, Dr. Edgy, Dr. Lipson. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and giving us some tangible strategies. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will be recording this and sending it out, so share it with your networks. And everyone have a lovely afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Thanks, Kelly.